The first code is the planning code after the general conditions. And the planning code refers also to the DWTSO and the users. Just to remind ourselves, this slide is coming up more often for each of the sections to engrave these abbreviations and definitions in our heads, because those are very important. Desalinated water transmission system operator operates the transmission system, SWCC pipeline department. Desalinated water producers operate the desalination plants, SWAC, independent water producers, or RAFIC or others. Non-seawater plant operators, some of the dams operated by SWCC, some of wells or dams operated by MOVI and NWC, and then the water distribution system operators, which are finally taking off the water at the interface of SWCC. Objective of the planning code is that a long-term prognosis of desalinated water, transmitted water in the kingdom will be prepared. And the planning code on that basis looks into demand, delivery, production forecasts, and the result of the planning code is the preparation of a 10-year statement in order to identify transmission capacity, required transmission capacities, in order to trigger new projects on the production side, on the transmission side, and carry out a long-term planning for the system. The planning code, as said, applies to the transmission system operator and all the users, but only those desalinated water plants which are connected to the transmission system. Because we look into transmission forecasts and delivery forecasts, it doesn't make sense to consider plants which are not connected to the system, because such plants, they will never receive dispatch instructions, they will never receive schedules for their capacity planning, etc. They are not contributing to the transmission activities and to supply water to the distribution system through the transmissions. But we need to consider those non-seawater plants which are connected to the systems, of course. In principle, the users, desalinated water producers, non-seawater plant operators, and the distribution system operators, they deliver planning data for a 10 years period to the TSO. Demand forecast from the distributors, production forecast from the producers, desalinated water producers, non-seawater plant operators. Other planning data may also be required and submitted to the TSO, which is collecting the data, consolidating the data for each transmission system, and preparing a 10-year statement to ECRA, which reveals extension programs, reinforcements, or improvements of the system. Improvements at the production side, at the interfaces, or for the transmission system. So 10 years, this period is required in order to identify the need for new projects upfront. If you consider that a pipeline to be installed from whatever, the eastern province up to Riyadh here takes several years for installation, it would take a year for planning, maybe for purchasing or procuring the contractor. So easily could end up for a period of, say, 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on the difficulty of the pipeline. This means you need to know 5 years ahead that you have to start right now for this new project. That's why a 10 years plan would be sufficient.
Excuse me? About this statement, I think it will be maybe not so accurate because they have sources not connected with the system. That means I need information only for the non-seawater production, only connected with it. If they have other sources not connected,
Yeah.
they have already. That means the statement will be not so accurate.
That's correct, and this is a fair comment. This planning data for the demand also and for the production, these planning data and forecast data must be prepared in a way that they apply to the system. So whenever we have a distribution system which are fed from two sources, say from the pipeline and from the other end through another well, and the distributor says, look, in next year I have a demand of, say, 100 cubic meter, just to give a reasonable figure for us here, 100. And the pipeline has a capacity of 60. And the other source will bring 40, then 100 will fit. 60 and 40. Under the planning and demand forecast, he says to him, look, I need from you pipeline 60 for next year. Because he bears in mind that he gets 40 from his well. The year after, he knows the well is not working properly, maybe decreasing in his abstraction. So he would only get 30 from the well. And then he would say, a year later, I need 70 from your end, or 80, because even in my area, more people coming and the demand increases.
Yeah, but maybe he's saving his sources. And there is
Come again?
He's saving the sources. This is not controlled by code.
Distribution is not monitored and regulated by ACRA. So there, the distributor needs to take reasonable steps and considerations in order to provide this demand data. But in order to go through with the distributors for the planning data, and the same, for instance, applies under the schedule and dispatch. The same applies for the other operational planning, which will one of the next presentations. It's only for the data which are or is relevant to the transmission system and the interface for that distribution system with the transmission system. Only for those. So end of June we said on a yearly basis. So this 10-year statement will be prepared on a rolling basis each year for the next 10 years. It's not 10 years and then after 10 years the next one. No, it's this year 10 years and next year another 10 years beginning from next year, and on a rolling basis. So each year by end of June the distributors, they have to submit the demand forecast for its distribution system in relation to the connection point. The desalinated water producers provides the production forecast for the connection point, and if they supply also the same issues here, if the desalinated water producers supply water and capacity to another plant-connected consumer, they have to subtract it. Otherwise, as you rightly stated, it will jeopardize the accuracy of the data, and no one could use the data properly.
Excuse me. If you plant for 10 years, then you say next year you will plant another 10. That means maybe they will not give you a good figure, because they will be thinking, okay, if I do, I will put for 10 years. Then next year I will put another, because it will be, it should be, whatever of the planning for 5 years or 6 years should be fixed. It should be, this is the
I got your point. If I understand is, if he knows that next year he can correct his figure, he will not consider thoroughly on the data he submitted for this year, for instance, the 6th year. This is right. On the other hand, if you do it on a rolling basis, the transmission system operator in Accra, they can go back to this entity and say, look, this year, or last year, you said in that year X, I need 100. Now you say, I need 200. How come? So you have always this plausibility check. And over the years, you have a kind of a trend line, which you can check and request from the entity providing this data, why is this fluctuation? Nobody knows what happens tomorrow. We can assume, we can make a best guess, and tomorrow is quite easy. Nobody knows what happens next year, and nobody knows what happens in 6 years. So the data provided today for 6 years may be good or bad, we don't know. But if we do every year the same considerations and action, and then compare the data for the year 2020, we then can see the trend and see, look, we have considered every year a similar data. And if there is less fluctuation, we may come to the conclusion, yes, it's a good figure. If there is a lot of fluctuation, but then eventually comes to a smaller range, it's a good figure. And if there is high fluctuation, we simply have a basis where we can request on what basis have you considered this data this year and next year, and for the same year prepared a curve with a high fluctuation. This cannot be done, this instrument of plausibility check and double checking cannot be done if you do it on a fixed term, 5 years, and when this is over, for the next 5 years. Then you don't have this instrument of double checking the figures provided. You do it every year? Yes, you have. And that's why we believe 10 years, it's a long period, we know, but it gives you 10 times data for 1 year. And you can prepare this trend curve, and you can do the double checking and request whether, in case you believe the data is not really good. So, June, you got the data, the TSO will get the data from the users. In August, he prepares basically the first plans, production forecast for that system. And here, the TSO must do it for each separate system, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. You can't consolidate it on this basis, because then you wouldn't have any result which you can use. The TSO may be required to run system studies, hydraulic studies, look at the interfaces, look at the flows, at the streams, where his system can cope with the capacities the producers offer and the distributors request. And then by end of the year, end of December, he finalizes the 10-year statement and hands it over to Accra. This each year. Information flow summary in detail again, and it's defined in more detail in the code, of course. All the users basically submit the same data. It's the daily average and the peak hourly volume flow of transmitted water within the required water quality. Why the daily average and the peak hourly volume? Daily average for the basis of the overall volume in such a year, and the peak in order to identify during the peaks where the system can cope with the flows for the system studies, as I said, to identify lacks of installed capacity, especially in the transmission line, pumping stations, or storage capacities. This holds true basically for the plant operators, non-seawater plant operators, by end of June to the TSO. Then the TSO may request additional data, but prepares then the total forecast and carries out the system studies by end of September. And then by end of the year, they provide then the 10-year statement to Accra.
So because peak hourly volume, for transmission it's difficult, I think, to give, because you have a quantity, from the protection, and you should, transmission this quantity to that. So that's, I mean, normally we are start at the beginning of the day, we are pumping more than the end of the days to control the volume which is allowed to us to take.
I think meaning the peak per year.
The peaks, see, the peak in the transmission system are influenced by the peaks in the producer, at the producer side and the distributor side. And you need to know the peaks from the users. You need to know the peaks or the users' intent during peaks, what they can really submit from their system into your system. And then you need to know what peaks are considered at the interface with the distributors, how much at peak periods the distributors suck out from your system. And you have to cope with it. That's why this information you get from the users as a TSO, then the TSO will look into his system whether the system can comply with the peaks or whether you have to balance the peaks through your storages, which is also a possibility, or whether you have to say reinforce or increase your capacity and performance of your pumping station, for instance.
Why the distribution? They are, I mean, distribute the water, I mean, frequently. For example, every day, from this time to this area, and from this time to that area. And for that, it will be, I think, we cannot find the peak.
I think, based on their experience in supplying the water to the people, they are able, the distributors are able to determine peaks and then forecast the peaks in future.
Peaks of months, we can see, okay, summer start,
yes.
Which is a peak.
This is exactly what you need.
Yeah, but this is been confused about hourly. That's meant in a daily basis. This is we cannot do it per daily basis.
No, this is the hourly peak for the 10-year statement. It's not
not daily basis.
It's for the 10-year statement. You provide the data on a daily basis, as far as I can recall. We can look into the code.
No, because it's difficult. Exactly, we cannot do it every day. What is the peak?
It's the highest peak.
Yes, highest peak in the year.
In the year. In the end, it's these figures you require. But in order to get it, you need to look at the different days. What is the peak at the different days? Weekdays or weekend days, whatsoever.
Monthly.
Monthly basis.
Even monthly.
Okay, sorry. And it's the highest peak on a daily basis, but for each month, so 12 data sets.
Oh, good.
Okay. This is just a small case study, just to illustrate how this is going to be worked. The demand here for one of the transmission system from 2,500 to 3,500 demand here, in another one from 400 to 900. On the production side, we have considered two plants with different capacities. And here you see this is a decreasing capacity, for instance. The plant operator says, look, my plant is getting old and I can't get, the performance of my plant is decreasing somehow. In order to keep the system running and not damaging it ahead of time, I have to decrease capacity, for instance. Or you consider that there is a major overhaul of one of the distillers each second year, and then there is a slight fluctuation in the production. These data are consolidated here, and then for the transmission system, you see whether there's a surplus or deficit. The same you will do with the flows in order to determine on which point here in your system you have the highest flow. Obviously, is somewhere here in between, but then the peaks needs to be considered as well in order to determine that under certain circumstances or under the maximum conditions also your system is working appropriately. And looking at that one, it shows how it's urgently required that there will be additional capacities initiated in order to say mitigate the deficit in 3 and 4 years' time. This is another illustration which you can get from the data you're provided with as the TSO, look into the daily capacity of the desalinated water producers, look into your daily storage capacities within the TSO system, transmission system, and then determine where to increase storage capacities, where to reinforce the system, or increase transmission line capacities at which year and in which area. Just in summary again, the planning code provides the procedures that enables the TSO for the 10-year statement to be elaborated, and the 10-year statement is simply a tool for responsible parties for the seawater desalination industry in order to trigger new projects and avoid supply gaps in future.